Good afternoon. Thanks, everyone, for coming. I'm Ari Schwartz. I am Managing Director for Cybersecurity Services at Venable, where we are pleased to be hosting this event today, working with the Potomac Institute as part of a series on the impact of 5G on national security. This is the second one that we've done here, and we hope to do more as well moving forward. We have a great panel for you today. I'm just going to quickly introduce them and step aside so we can get into the meat of the discussion. I'm going to work from the far end back this way. We have Frank Konieczny, who is the Air Force Chief Information Technology Officer in the Office of the Deputy Chief Information Officer. He has a primary responsibility to advance the IT and technology landscape for the Air Force. Previous to being in the Air Force, he was at Teledyne, Brown Engineering, SAIC, General Research, and then most recently was employed 10 years at AT&T Government Solutions, professional business unit, where he served as CIO, CTO, and the Executive Director for Operations. Next, we have Duane Florenzi. Mr. Florenzi is Senior Strategy Executive at the U.S. Secretary of the Air Force Office of Commercial and Economic Analysis. Previously, before coming into the Air Force, he was at Cisco and General Electric Digital, where he worked on mobile networks, Internet of Things, and artificial intelligence. And prior to that, as part of that work, he managed Cisco's mobile architecture business in Japan. And prior to that, he had diplomatic roles as an officer within the U.S. Air Force in both Japan and Hong Kong. He has an MBA from the Haas School of Business at Berkeley. Next, we have Dr. Timothy Grayson. Dr. Grayson is Director of Strategic Technology Office at DARPA. In this role, he leads the office in development of breakthrough technologies to enable warfighters to field, operate, adapt distributed joint, multi-domain combat capabilities at continuous speed. Dr. Grayson came to STO from a career in government and industry, including where he was founder and president of Fortitude Mission Research, LLC. Prior to that, he spent several years as senior intelligence officer within the CIA and the director of science and technology, culminating in a tour in the ODNI. Prior to the CIA, Dr. Grayson was program manager and senior scientist at DARPA. Dr. Grayson holds a doctorate in physics from the University of Rochester. And finally, our moderator for the day is Dr. Michael Fritze. Dr. Fritze is Vice President of the Potomac Institute for Policy Studies, responsible for microelectronics policy portfolio. His current interests and activities include USG trusted access strategies, support of needed legacy technologies, DoD innovation policy, and outreach to industry and strengthening the U.S. microelectronics industrial base. Previous to that, he was Dr. Fritze was Director of Disruptive Electronics Division at USC. He was a program manager at DARPA, the Microsystems Technology Office. And prior to joining DARPA, he was a staff member at the MIT Lincoln Laboratory. He has a PhD in physics from Brown University. So I'm going to hand things over now to Dr. Fritze. Thanks again.
Thanks, Ari, and I just wanted to thank Venable, too, for a very fruitful collaboration that Potomac and Venable have had on technology issues of mutual interest. So it's great. I hope we have many years of future collaboration. Just wanted to say a brief word on the Potomac Institute. I know many of you probably know us. We are a science and technology think tank. We are, and I'm going to say three things that are important because they characterize us, so I'm saying them very slowly. We're independent, so we don't take corporate money. We are a nonprofit, and we are nonpartisan. So that basically characterizes, that's the 30-second summary of the kind of work that we do. Our mission is to understand technology trends out in the world and come up with government policy strategies for that. So when I was a younger engineer, my objective was to understand how something works or to get something to work. In the policy world, you want to understand technology developments and then think about, well, what should the government role be here, if any? And that's a somewhat different question, right? So I just wanted to sort of set the stage. This is why we're doing this event. We have we have an academic center at Potomac called the Vital Center, which deals with critical infrastructure. And these series of 5G events that we've had most recently are part of the Vital Center. We're interested in other topics as well. So we have covered areas like security, critical infrastructure security for finance, for automotive, for pharma, and other areas as well. So that's part of our Vital Center activities, our internal activities. So enough with the long introduction. I want to move right on to the speakers. I always have a warm place in my heart for DARPA, so I'm very, very happy to introduce Dr. Grayson from the Strategic Technologies Office. Ari already gave you his biography, and I'm very eager to hear what his thoughts are on the 5G issue facing the DoD. So without further ado, Tim.
Okay, great. Okay, just to talk from here. Okay.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah, so good afternoon. Yeah, it is afternoon, everyone. Yeah. So thanks for the opportunity to come and meet with all of you. So first of all, I want to caveat by saying that, and this is DARPA across the board, but specifically on 5G, DARPA is a very bottoms-up, dynamic kind of place. There is no mandated top-down strategy on 5G at DARPA. There is no program for DARPA in 5G. It really is a loose collection of things across the agency and across a number of different offices outside of mine. Frankly, we are still, in my personal opinion, not moving as quickly as I would like to see us moving in this area, and I'll come back to the main reason why at the end of my remarks, and I've got to ask for the community here. But at any rate, it's an area that I am personally passionate about, so I just want to caveat that my comments here are more my own thoughts on the matter and not reflecting of a particular program or initiative at DARPA. So 5G first popped up. So I've had some personal background related to telecommunications and wireless. Most recently, with my consulting firm before coming back into government, was doing a lot of infrastructure red teaming for carriers and other public utility critical infrastructure types of things. So, it was kind of staying abreast of what was happening in the telecommunications and wireless world, but frankly wasn't paying attention to 5G until about a year and a half ago. And, all of a sudden you couldn't throw a rock around Washington without someone saying 5G. And I'm not going to go into a lot of the back and forth political noise that happened around that time frame. But DARPA got pinged during the middle of all of that by multiple different directions saying, hey, you guys are the DoD's advanced research arm. What do you think about 5G? It's like, well, okay, it comes after 4G. But that did at least get enough attention and got us paying attention to it. So we reached out, pulled in a lot of experts, spent some time reviewing the standards myself. And all of a sudden, I went from thinking this was going to be a sort of a political flash in the pan that we could maybe answer some data calls and then ignore, to something that personally became very exciting and something that I really think we need to be very serious about at a place like DARPA. And there were two big things that caught my attention. I'll start with something that perhaps is a little bit contrarian. I don't know what the other panelists will have to say about this, but there's a lot, as soon as you say 5G, a lot of the discussion immediately goes to spectrum and talking about things like very high frequencies and millimeter wave and spectrum rights and chips and parts, and is it going to be millimeter wave or is it going to be sub-6, and all of these discussions around that. When I started looking into the details, my personal opinion is that that's a little bit of, if not a red herring, at least a distraction from where the important issues are. And the thing that I honed in on were a couple of attributes of 5G that get less attention than the high frequencies and the high bandwidths. From a DoD standpoint, we care tremendously about low latency. In my view, low latency is actually much more important than high data rates. Second attribute, virtualization. One of the terms you'll hear used in the context of 5G is slicing. And this notion of creating what appears to be almost like a virtual private network layered on top of public infrastructure. which is what a lot of the doers of 5G right now are looking at for enterprise types of customers. So I looked at this from a DoD standpoint and from where are there research opportunities. And a few main points jumped out. One, there were a lot of things we were already doing in my office that those two attributes of low latency and virtualization jumped out to me as something that we ought to be exploiting for our own purposes. And frankly, this is, I will call this a standalone tactical applications of 5G, as opposed to whatever the commercial world is going to do with particular implementations. The reason for that, I know several of the people here, and you've probably heard me talk in other forums about our big office strategy of mosaic warfare. We're trying to be able to piece things together in a very heterogeneous, federated type of manner. That includes networks. I've got to be able to create what amount to virtual data links between military systems using whatever communications fabric is available. And my office has already been doing programs looking at purely military tactical networks. And how do I build a network of networks out of a bunch of individual piece part tactical networks? It's not as agile. It's not as open-ended as I'd like it to be. I'd truly like us to get to where a warfighter can show up at a fight somewhere, say, okay, all these different weapon systems have to talk to each other, and they're all on different radios and different networks. How can I take advantage of whatever comms are there and in a very opportunistic way create virtual links? So that's what we were already thinking about in the context of mosaic warfare. That's really hard to do with our military radios. Turns out when we looked at the 5G standard and this notion of virtualization and slicing, particularly supported again by those low latencies, we were like, wow, we could actually consider using 5G as the fabric to be able to create network of networks on top of that. So that's one area, and again, we don't have explicitly a program there, but it's something that we're keenly interested in from a research perspective. The second big observation, and it's related to it's related to both those attributes. You don't get low latency and you don't get virtualization without getting into the network core. You know, again, so much of the attention in 5G is focused on the radio layer, the RAN, the radio access network. But you've got to eventually get to implementations that are also changing the core of the 5G network. And it doesn't have to be this way. There are a lot of different ways to implement 5G, and the commercial folks are out there looking at all of them. But you could get to a future, and I would predict we will get to a future where at some point in time, the old dingy telco central offices with lots of custom routers and switches in them is going to be replaced with a shiny data center filled with digital servers running software-defined networks. And we'll see the core of this network replaced by a whole stack of SDNs. That, again, has opportunities from the DoD being able to think about building standalone implementations of this without having to carry a whole central office with us if we go into a theater somewhere. But it also has an interesting and frankly, very worrisome defensive side of it because, you know, historically, we've got a lot of critical infrastructure that the U.S. relies upon, both for government and civil applications, that relies on a very robust wide area core in our telecommunications system. If in some time in the future, driven by 5G and other economic forces, we end up seeing that core replaced by server rooms filled with software-defined networks, there potentially is a vulnerability or a fragility associated with that could impact our critical infrastructure. So I'm very interested in 5G, understanding 5G, and looking what we can do to secure 5G from, I'll call it a critical infrastructure defense mindset. And then my last comment is back to one of the questions that popped up in all of the initial sort of initial political excitement over 5G. There is a very real issue of who's going to have technology leadership and who's going to have standards leadership and who's going to have market leadership. And there's a lot of stickiness that happens as soon as one country or region or global corporation gets a lead in any of those areas. you know, DARPA isn't in a position, like you hear from some of the other gentlemen, to actually get into acquiring large things to be operated or to get into industrial policy. Our big lever to play in this is the technology. So one of the other things we're looking at are what are holes in the technology. Originally, we were thinking, hey, we've lost 5G. The standard's out the door. The U.S. has lost its influence in 5G. Let's start thinking about 6G, whatever that means. No one really knows. And start looking at, are there technologies that DARPA could help fund to stimulate U.S. competitiveness in a future 6G state. Again, as we've looked at it more, I actually think that we're being a little bit pessimistic, saying we've got to wait to 6G. Yes, the standard is pretty well baked for 5G, but how exactly it's going to get implemented, and it's going to be a very gradual, incremental set of implementation of 5G. And we're actually looking at things where we can do R&D projects that address challenges in 5G implementation that are dual use. They may solve a commercial problem as well as they solve a military problem. And I think there's a tremendous opportunity if organizations like DARPA can get in there and fund some of those research activities and pilot projects, that it opens up the door for public-private partnerships, even to influence some of the actual commercial implementation that can help buy back U.S. competitiveness in this area.
Thanks. Thank you, Tim. I think what we'd like to do is we'd like to go through and let everyone make their remarks first, and if people can hold their questions to the discussion session, that's going to be the meat, actually, of this event. So with your patience, please hold your questions for Tim until we finish. Next up is Mr. Dwayne Florenzi, from currently representing the Industrial Policy Office at OSD.
Great. Hey, thank you. So I came back to government in the past year, and so actually I've been very impressed with the movement towards innovation and the drive to try to do new things and to bring in the advanced technologies. And so last October I joined the government delegation to Mobile World Congress in Los Angeles, and I've been to many different trade shows in telecom because I used to be with, which is currently Nokia, and Cisco and GE. But I've never seen the government have such a presence. And much of it was DARPA. And they dominated the trade show floor with a live mobile network simulator. And they had a year-long competition on spectrum sharing. And then they had a big event during that time as well, announcing the winners, and everybody got real involved in it. So it was a huge part of the show. And then on top of that, then DOD's Dr. Lisa Porter announced that their DOD is setting up 4 test beds for 5G. And she did this in conjunction with NTIA and FCC. So DOD was a big presence at that trade show, which I'd never seen in shows in the past. And then now, since being involved with the Air Force part, I see the Air Force has a number of different innovation centers where they're pulling in startup companies for some of these advanced technologies and trying to tap into some of their expertise and experience. And then Frank Konechny is going to tell us there about some of the Air Force bases of how they're implementing advanced technologies. And so I've been really impressed to see where things are going. So I want to share I want to use my opening remarks to talk a little bit about what's the foundation, so we have a common framework on what 5G is, because there's so many misconceptions out there. The biggest question I get so often is, so is 5G here, or is it not yet? And the answer is both. Last night, I saw a TV commercial here of another mobile operator that I had not seen a commercial on before, claiming that they already have 5G nationwide coverage, including rural areas, which is it's not possible to believe. It's like, talk about.
But they've discovered 600 megahertz.
It was 600 megahertz. Yes, that's what it was. I know
that commercial.
Specific frequencies now. Well,
that's right. Well, I know that. Yeah.
So, but there's 3 parts of 5G. And that's what a lot of people don't understand. Most people think that it's just an extension of 4G. And all we have today, the 5G that we have today, that's all it is. It is an extension of 4G in terms of broadband, massive enhanced broadband. So quicker downloads, more data. And that's not insignificant because Korea launched nationwide 5G just with that capability. And they signed up 1 million people in 3 months. And so that's for basically higher speed video as well as virtual reality. So that is a significant market, but that's not what 5G really is. 5G is really the other two areas. It's the low latency and the Internet of Things. And so those things are unique because we never had such connections to such a massive amount of things in terms of the Internet of Things. And then we've never had this kind of low latency in any way in terms of really no delay. And so these are the critical technologies that are really going to change things. And the standards aren't even complete until this summer. So that's where 5G is not here yet. What most of us are really excited about in terms of the transformational aspect of 5G is not out there yet. And so that's why there's so many misconceptions of what's out there right now. So one story that I try to tell on what 4G is versus 5G. Well, actually, it's just right now the Tesla has autopilot, and I call it a bubble. Basically, it's just radar around the vehicle. That's not even 4G. It's just radar around the vehicle. But with 5G, the automobiles will be able to talk to each other. They'll be getting information from the lampposts, which will tell them about traffic conditions. They can get weather information. If the city is equipped with video, they can also get information about pedestrians in the area. And now also with the emergence of artificial intelligence, it can take all that information, process it, and make decisions. And so that's the transformational aspect I think that 5G is going to bring about. If a vehicle were connected to 4G right now, it would take the vehicle would move over 4 feet before the signal came back. But with 5G, it'd be less than 4 inches. So that's a real dramatic change. That's what we're talking about, the low latency. And that's where it's not just going to affect vehicles, it would affect drones as well. And so why are we so concerned about security related to 5G? 4G connects our phones. We might find information about the people or maybe some of the data. But 5G is going to connect to our critical infrastructure in ways that it has never had before. And that's where the concern is. 5G is completely different than 4G because of the access that that network will provide to our critical infrastructure. And another example that I give on that one is like the petroleum end-to-end process. Right now, there are isolated aspects of this whole process. But with 5G, it has the potential to connect every node and take in all that information and make decisions, give visibility. The value is tremendous, but also the attack vectors are also tremendous. And so this is, again, it's a new area that we're giving access to our energy grids or to other very critical infrastructure. So then the other area I want to mention is that 5G is going to take some time. If you look at LTE, it's really taken about, LTE came out about 10 years ago. And only now is it achieving all the things that LTE had promised 10 years ago. But it is achieving it, but it's taken 10 years. And it's come out actually in 3 different segments of standards. So that's where I think 5G, it's not too late for 5G. We're only in the we're not even finished with the first
Barely got
segment
15. 15 was frozen.
For 5G. So we have many more iterations of 5G to go until its maturity. And so that's another reason why there's this misconception. Oh, well, 5G, it's not doing all the things that it said. Well, we're just really at the infant stage. But the critical things, the decisions are being made today. And that's why there's so much attention, because once you go down a certain track, it's really hard to make adjustments. Okay, and one other thing before I move on here in terms of moving it back into DoD, and that is something you also alluded to, is that each generation has had a country or a region that has really flourished as a result. For 2G, it was really GSM and Europe that really dominated, and it really helped that region. For 3G, you could say that Japan was a leader with iMode. It gave connection to people, to information. It was really a precursor to mobile internet. And then with 4G, it's really been the US that's the dominant. And much of that has been through smartphone adoption that has really moved the internet onto the phones. And as a result, we see video and music and all these other type of applications that have flourished and really has impacted innovation in America as well as our economy. And so that's why 5G is also a big issue for which region or country is going to be the lead, because it is going to have an impact on our innovative capabilities as well as our economy. I also consider 5G more of an umbrella. I think people look at it too narrowly. Basically, they're just thinking about the mobile network. But 5G is going to touch all the advanced technologies coming about. It's going to impact, as I already mentioned, autonomous vehicles, but also drones, augmented reality, virtual reality, robotics, smart factories, and then smart cities, including surveillance cameras and all. So 5G is going to advance all these other technologies. But generally, everybody's been focused on the infrastructure. But 5G is so much more. It's the handsets, it's data centers, and then it's all these other different applications that are going to come out of it. And so we need to pay attention as well as for security on all those areas, and I think they're being overlooked. So let me shift a little bit, finishing my remarks here about just where I see potential for Department of Defense to go. And one of them, I think, is factory automation, manufacturing. If we can take 5G to impact efficiency, productivity, and reduce cost in all of the manufacturing that is done either by DoD or by contractors, that's a really significant impact. And so I think 5G really has a potential, very much because of this low latency, that you can even set up a 5G factory where it's private, and you can keep all the information there, and you improve the low latency. If you're manufacturing an aircraft engine blade and it's a very expensive piece of equipment and it's going off tolerance because of the low latency, you can immediately correct it. And then the person down on the shop floor can use their augmented reality and pull up the schematics or the information. And so there's ways that really interact in ways that we don't have that capability now. Other ways related to manufacturing is product and material tracking, complicated shapes, high precision. I mentioned, again, augmented reality, virtual reality usage, dangerous environments, able to do things remotely, documentation, and then also staff optimization. And this is not so far in the future because, in fact, there's a few different factories that are already starting this on 5G, and one of them is Mercedes-Benz in Germany. And that factory should be completed this year, and it's going to have over 300 autonomous vehicles, unmanned autonomous vehicles. And what that allows them to do is they can adjust the assembly line according to demand, and they can also customize by inserting new capabilities into the assembly line, so that not everything is going to be bolted down, but they're going to have that kind of flexibility. And I already mentioned then you have also the augmented reality, virtual reality that gives more visibility on what's going on in the factory. And then related to the military, I already see things going on that Frank's going to talk about related to base operations. And if you think of a military base, basically it's a small city. And so there's so many different ways that we can start applying 5G quickly to that. The other areas is combat operations, in terms of being able to move with mobility, have command and control, and then also training. So I think these are all ways that we can consider how do we incorporate this into the military. And you can see a lot of this is dual use. It's things that are going to benefit society as well as will benefit us in DoD. I'm not sure what Frank's going to talk about, I'll let you talk about all the base activity. If not, if it doesn't come up on the DoD test sites, we'll talk about it in the Q&A. So I'll leave that at that point. But I hope this gives you a kind of more of a foundation on what 5G is and why it's so important, and alleviate some of the misconceptions that are out there, and hopefully you can correct many of the people that foster those misconceptions, and then gives you also an idea of some of the innovation that DoD is shooting for related to 5G.
Great. So thank you very much, Dwayne. This is great to get these opening perspectives. Again, I ask the audience, please hold your questions for the Q&A session. Okay.
Okay.
I think we're good. I think we were having an issue. We're having an audiovisual thing.
Spectrum
So
issue.
we'll proceed to the last panelist that we have. Frank, is it Konechny?
It's Konechny. Don't worry about it.
Konechny, right? Did I say right? Okay.
Yeah.
Frank Konechny, who's going to represent the Air Force on the deployment side of 5G.
Right. I'm where the rubber meets the road and actually getting this into the field, where we have research, we have policy. Now it's how do you actually do this?
Yes.
And okay, we started this journey a while back, and we have. I'll tell you what we're doing right now, and then I can tell you what the journey was. We basically said we had to. You think that all the bases have connectivity? They don't. Remember, they are small cities, and to have a small city, you have to have somebody who wants to pay for putting connectivity at a base. And so what we tried to do now is we've come out with an initiative for starting LTE, moving to 5G for each of the bases. And we're doing this by regions. Because we found that if we bunched the regions together into 10 to 15 bases, that we could actually get one vendor to actually put it there on a commercial side for us without actually charging us anything. I mean, it's all commercial. We're trying to do commercial first. And the reason why we're trying to do commercial is we can't afford the optical backhaul. There's no way we could actually do this and we don't want to maintain it. This is something else because we are not in the business of maintaining wireless networks. That is not our bailiwick. The Air Force is out to mission, and mission is not maintaining networks. Trust me. So we want to be able to capability to say, okay, we want to put it out on the bases, and so we've gone through the first round, which has been 15 bases in the southeast region right now. Some of them have LTE equipped already in the regions now. They've already put 2 LTEs at the bases. We're looking for 5G to be put into 2 more bases, 5G, besides LTE, to 2 bases, probably in September or so. And the reason why it's taking so long is because of policy issues, spectrum analysis, FAA regulations, environmental impact statements, and particularly where are you going to put the radios. This is a big deal. The sightings of the radios are very important. And when you come into a base, and a base is a city. Trust me, 5,000 people, a lot of square miles, kids, families, planes, you name it, it's there. Grocery stores, everything, it's a city. And so you have to say, how am I going to implement a city? And how am I going to pay for this? And that's why we have to go commercial initially. So the initial capability is put out there commercially, and start using that, not from also from the commercial side, but also from the military side. And commercially, I mean, we put out the request for licensing, and we basically said we want to be able to we'll give you the areas where we want coverage on the bases, and you tell us how you're going to provide that coverage and what the strength of the signal is, and et cetera, for those areas. And whoever gives us the best signal strength and everything else, and the plan going forward to move to 5G, we will give you the opportunity to have the lease. And the lease is for, a base can give a lease to a vendor for 5 years. This is from the headquarters level, so we can give a lease to the vendor for 25 years. Because you want to be able to have a proper return on investment for that vendor within like 15 bases. So we gave them an incentive. Also, we do not charge for the lease, which is something you have to do if you're not careful. So we basically said we waive the charging for the lease. You will just tell us what the stuff is, and we'll go forward with it. And to bundle this better together, we put the the spectrum analysis into a package deal that if you have the same spectrum across all 10 bases, you do one analysis and it's approved for all 10 bases. And 15 bases. Big deal. Which got rid of lots of red tape, and also every vendor had to pay spectrum analysis for every base before, separately. And that's $20,000, $50,000 a base. So we put a lot of incentives in. So we got the first 10 done. Now we're going to do another Northwest region, which is going to be 17 bases. And that's again, the RFI is running out. We're going to do the next piece of it coming out, and we're going to have to get another opportunity to lease. And whoever wins it for the 17 bases, and we negotiate basically how long the lease is for, and ups to that lease. And we wanted to do this because we started a long time ago talking about smart bases. We had a pilot at Maxwell Air Force Base for a smart base, and we limited it to basically the safety side, because the safety officers wanted to know who was interfering, who was coming on the base, who was going on the runways, the fence line, and also the cameras, and who's coming in. And it worked really well, except it wasn't fast enough. Security officers loved it. I mean, they got instantaneous response. Well, instantaneous back then was pretty interesting. An instantaneous response. But the idea was it wasn't covered enough. There wasn't enough coverage, and we couldn't actually do this. And so we're looking at, okay, what can we do for 5G will give us that coverage we need for the base and adds more sensors to the system. So that's where we started with. We also have various virtual reality AV pilots right now. We have pilots actually doing training with AV right now. In fact, we have it with NATO. And so we are down the path of doing this, and we want to extend it. And I'll tell you about the extensions. The extensions we want to do, like for pilot training, was basically we want to go across multiple buildings and multiple bases. Can't do that right now. Speed is not fast enough. Can't support that. So we want to do that. We want to be able to have capabilities on the flight line to actually bring out augmented reality and virtual reality to help the maintainers actually maintain the planes. We don't have connectivity yet. So to do that, we have to go to connectivity. So we were looking at all these pilots or capabilities we wanted to have, but we didn't have the connectivity to do that. So that's why we're going down a path of putting out on every Air Force base these capabilities, where we're going to eventually start with LTE and move out. And I'll tell you the problem we have with the vendors. It's not really a problem. It's their business cases. You can't put 5G everywhere because of the amount of antennas that you actually need, and it costs money. So when we talk about putting 5G at a base, especially with millimeter waveform, they want to know where you want it, and that's it. Because otherwise it'll be sub-6 is what they want to put out initially, and then they'll go for millimeter wave someplace where you really need it. And so we've been having that discussions with them already as to how do you want it, where do we want it, what are we going to get out of it. But then let's talk about the other pieces. Okay, once we
just make it clarifying. Sure. I hate to jump in when I said hold the questions, but clarifying statement. So your base implementations, are they sub-6 or millimeter wave or both?
They will be both.
Okay.
Eventually.
Okay.
Okay.
Sorry for the interruption.
That's okay. Okay, so that's one phase. Okay, that's not the experimental phase. That's the one phase. That's what we're trying to get to that and try to implement accordingly. And we'll get to that pretty. The question then becomes, okay, and we want to do this at the depots. We talked about this before. We probably will set up a private network at the depots. And the reason why is because for all the IoT devices, we're going to get so much data in, we can't send it someplace. Okay, so we always talk about we're going to have micro data centers at the edge, in essence, at the base stations. Okay, what does that mean? Because all of a sudden, that little micro data center is going to be really, really powerful because it's accumulating, 10,000, 100,000 IoT device things coming in. So all of a sudden, when we talk about, we want to do this, you have to think about what is the processing capability going to be required at the edge now? Because we can't send it across the lines to someplace else. I mean, it could, but it's to be, why bother? The problem space we have is that if the issue is occurring at the base, it'd be nice if the base would understand that issue and fix it. instead of sending up somebody to headquarters and headquarters coming down to the base and say, hey, you have a problem, you should fix it. Which is, which is the standard philosophy that everybody has. I got to send it to some central organization that's going to tell us there's a problem, So we're trying to support that too. So we have to work on that. Probably one of the experiments that we're trying to eventually get to is how to do this with our IoT devices. But let's go back to security for IoT devices. We have a lot of dumb IoT devices. And so we're looking at a way of securing those IoT devices and making sure they're authenticatable. We have two SBIRs basically looking at this right now of how to actually put hardware in the loop or software or something else at the same time and encrypt the signal across so that we authenticate the IoT signals coming in, because a spoofing way to mess you up is to mess up your IoT. And my favorite example is always tire pressure for a tanker truck. If I can affect the tire pressure of a tanker truck and tell you have a flat tire, you may take that tanker truck out of service and it'll affect a mission because I'm missing a tanker truck. That's a simple one. I mean, there's other ones that showing that the fuel is not in the tanker truck, the wrong fuel is there. There's all sorts of things that you could do if you think about how you would like to mess up IoT devices. That's a simple IoT device error. But it's simply that the simple errors are the ones that always kill us. It's not the complex ones. So as we go forward with IoT devices and we talk about at the depots, these are the things we're looking at the depots. Yes, we have a lot of devices at the depots. We have devices that measure tolerances all over the place. As Dwayne said, they're not connected, or they're connected in some ways, but not really connected to anything central. And we want to be able to automatically turn things off if they are bad. And that's one of the experiments we wanted to do anyway, so we'll eventually get to. So for the experiments for DoD that we're starting right now is that for Hill Air Force Base, we're actually doing an experiment for network for spectrum sharing, which means we want to be able to share spectrum across the board, because as we go forward, you probably know this, our spectrum is not the same spectrum that's in Europe and Asia. So eventually we're going to get to a point where we are going to have a conflicting set of spectrum. And so we're trying to figure out a way, how is the best way to share spectrum? How do we actually maintain military operations in a shared spectrum environment where we are having a problem with the spectrum? I mean, everyone's talked about spectrum per se of allocations, but we're getting to the point where we are going to kind of start conflicting somewhere along the way here. Likewise, we're going to have, if you heard, the NDA put Nellis Warfare Center as the 5G center for DoD for network for warfare analysis. So between Hill Air Force Base and Nellis Air Force Base, and they are back-to-back with each other through various test ranges, we're going to push those two together and basically run 5G experiments across both of them in a clustered environment or whatever, and we have to figure this out. And also the University of Utah from the National Science Foundation has a 5G test bed also. And this is all in Utah. So it's kind of Utah and Nevada. We're all there. So we're trying to figure out how to best utilize all the resources that currently sit there right now, how to actually do the experiments with it. I mean, one of the other experiments is a virtual reality experiment, and a joint base from the Army and the Air Force of how soldiers in the field can actually work with virtual reality to actually communicate with each other and work with each other. The Navy and the Marine Corps have the smart ports experiments, and they're going to figure out how to actually do that, and that's going to be more IoT devices. This is the never-ending thing with the IoT devices. That we're going to have lots of IoT, and the question is always, how am I going to process all this information, and what can I make out of this? So as we move forward, you can see IoT devices coming in. We want to secure the IoTs, and we want to secure all end devices, let's put it that way, because we're going to have lots of end devices. And we're going to have to figure out how much processing capability I'm going to have at the base. And since we always want to go to AI and something else, you're going to get to a very difficult, very quick processing capability that's going to be there, because it's not going to be a cheap issue. Now, at each of the bases, we are planning to have a data center at each of the bases anyways. And so we'll probably upgrade the data center to support whatever we want to do for this capability. But again, it's an issue of how do I feed this information directly into the data center in a way that is expeditious for getting the missions done. The other thing is shared. Well, let's talk about something else that we have as an issue. Okay, I have 5G at a base. It's working really well. I send it someplace else. I send it to Europe. It goes through a 4G, 3G, 2G, 4G, 3G, 5G endpoint. And we talk about network slicing. We say, okay, I sliced it at the 5G. What's coming out the other end? And the answer is, no one knows yet what's coming out the other end. They basically say, it's, oh, VPNs, trust us. And we're like, I don't trust you guys. I don't know what's coming out the other end. You know? And so the concern is we may have 5G at a base, but I still have to go through the legacy infrastructure that's existing out there and maintain continuity somehow. And we've talked to the vendors about this, and they're still wondering how to do this. And I think that's, that's going to be the evolution of how you're actually going to implement some of the capabilities we've seen in the spec already. And I don't know if, it's going to take a while to do this, and we're just going to have to work through it all. And that's the same way we're going to have to work through any of the devices that are sitting in Europe right now. I mean, Air Force is a multi-country international organization. We communicate with lots of people. We communicate with our multi-partner environments, people across the world. So it's not like we are just going to stay in CONUS. We don't. We're everywhere. And we have to have communications everywhere. So some of the concerns has always been, well, I'm pushing through this, and I may get. So the endpoint, let's list some things. The endpoint we want to make sure is secure. All phones will be secured in a certain way, and they have to be approved. And we all have NIAP phones and everything else right now. The reason why is because we want to be the endpoint secure. We'll probably do end-to-end encryption within anything we do. It's a standard pretty much that we do anyways. Therefore, we are concerned about any intercepts occurring, and it's going to be encrypted. And this is beyond the encryption of where you see between the RAN and whatever. It's better. It's more than just that. It is the whole thing. So the question is, what can happen? You can stop, something could happen in the communications network and stop the communication. And so the idea is we have to have alternative means of communication to achieve the mission. And those alternative means could be satellites. It could be anything else we come up with. Which leads us to another cyber experiment that we're doing. I'm supporting it, is how we're going to do 5G communication between airplanes. In fact, it has a commercial bent to it. You'll like this. It has a commercial bent because, and it's two Air Force guys who are trying to do a commercial entity to actually spew videos between points across the ocean, and all you need is 3 planes in the ocean across the ocean to actually do the communications now. They're doing waveforming and everything else. And 5G is going to allow them to do even more waveforming and more capabilities as they go forward with the cyber experiment. And so when you hear from DoD, they're going to talk about joint all-domain operations. It used to be multi-domain, now it's all-domain. They've increased it. So any possible domain you have is out there. It's going to be part of joint. And the idea is to have the connectivity across all the components at the same time in a certain way. And so between the beamforming that's in the 5G spec and the slicing that's supposed to be there also, it's how are you going to maintain everything that you want to do in a secure manner. And that's where we are trying to get to. But it's going to be lots of experiments that are going to have to be done to actually support this and figure this out. And as DoD has gone through the first 4 experiments, there's going to be 3 more experiments coming out this quarter and 3 more the next quarter and hopefully 3 more the quarter after that. And it's going to be at various Air Force bases and Navy and Army bases. So we're spreading it across, but we're also sharing with each other. We're going to learn from the port experiments that the Navy and the Marine Corps are doing, and we're probably going to apply them back to the depots in the Army and the Air Force, because that's the intent, is to learn from what they're doing and go back and correct things and do some more experiments and things. Well, that's, and I think that's about it. I mean, I have a lot of, Wayne talked about, how you do advanced technology and stuff. I do a lot of SBIRs myself. I have like 8 SBIRs I'm running right now from various capabilities across the Air Force. But we probably have more. But we're trying to do advanced technologies and looking at it from an experimental viewpoint of how I want to put things into the field, as opposed to just saying I'm going to use the big vendors to do stuff.
My comment what SBIR is?
Oh. What is SBIR?
Small Business
Innovation Research.
Good. Okay, so thank you, everybody. It was great to have sort of a nice, and thank you for being concise, relatively concise perspectives from the different pieces of the puzzle that you represent, which is awesome. I think I'd like to start. Maybe I'll prime the pump with with asking a first question or so, and then we'll get to the audience. So we'll have some time to chat, because I find this is the most valuable part, to see what's on people's minds, what are the issues that they care about. So maybe I'll start with a question for Tim. We all know that 5G is a large commercial investment, right? The commercial world is putting in huge amounts of money for this. So the argument for government and DARPA, so what do you view as DARPA or the government's proper role, given the fact that, industry is putting in huge amounts of money? So what is the unique opportunity here for the government to make a difference?
So I'll toss out a couple of examples. And to the point that you made, Mike, about the difference in money, just throwing a lot of money at the problem isn't going to move the needle. We're looking at things where we can look at, try to do research on key problems that the commercial world doesn't necessarily have solutions to right now as they figure out how to implement it. Like I said during my comments, maybe getting ahead of the game, thinking about 6G. And then other places where we can leverage investment in military unique technology that can be applied to 5G and related. And I'll put it in 3 examples. One near and dear to your heart, which my counterpart office, MTO, they're the ones that did that Spectrum Collaboration Challenge, has been thinking about. They are one of the leaders in thinking about things like high frequency, high power, very efficient semiconductor materials. So, one of the things they're starting to explore is, could they move even higher in frequency and bandwidth? So that's not going to necessarily impact 5G, but that's something that the DoD is really good at developing that could put us ahead of the game thinking about 6G or where do these standards go next. Something else that was alluded to, I think particularly by Frank, the security aspect of things. If you look at the current 5G standard, which again is pretty well locked down right now, it's actually surprisingly, maybe frighteningly weak on the security standards. There's a fair amount of security at the transec layer and at the authentication layer. So if someone wants to log onto or attach to a 5G network, there are decent standards there. But when we talk about these slices, there's very little about how to protect both the privacy and integrity of those slices. So if there was someone with ill intent who was already living properly authenticated onto a 5G network, it's pretty loose security moving in between these slices. And you could imagine someone sneaking in and attacking a slice in some way, either disrupting it or stealing it or corrupting it. So we're looking at things related to security, very much along the lines of what Frank said with the SBIR, but one of the things we had our own SBIR in this area that was trying to say, how can we kill 2 birds with 1 stone? Again, trying to leapfrog where commercial might be investing, and said, the commercial world knows how to apply crypto and, whatever your favorite AES or whatever crypto standard there is. Are there other ways to think about security that don't involve traditional crypto, which has all kinds of issues associated with key distribution and how do I configure it exactly? So one of the SBIRs that we had a number of years ago, and this doesn't transfer to a full network, but it illustrates the different type of thinking that we're trying to apply here. This SBIR looked at something, for those of you who are not RF radio experts, channel sounding. So if you have 2 radios that are talking to each other, they can make measurements about what the RF characteristics are between the 2 of them. That is information that is unique to those 2 radios at those 2 locations. If there's a bad guy somewhere else, he can try to do the same technique, but because he's in a different place and time, he's going to see different information. That's actually the definition of a key in cryptography. Information that the good guys share and have common to them, and that bad guys don't have access to. So you could think about using the environment to actually create what amount to keys. So that's an area of research we've been dabbling in. And I mentioned the third thing. There was discussion by both the speakers of some of the challenges associated with where to put antennas and millimeter wave and things of that nature. Something the DoD is really good at. This is an example of bringing other technology to the table that could sweeten the pot for commercial players. DoD is really good at measuring spectrum and modeling spectrum and propagation. So one of the ideas we're kicking around right now, again, it's not, none of these are programs yet, but one of the ideas we're kicking around is, could we apply the expertise DoD has in measuring and modeling spectrum and channel propagation to try to make the millimeter wave frequency types of systems easier to deploy and then more stable and reliable once you deploy them. That is a huge issue for the commercial players that they're struggling with tremendously. And frankly, from a North American competitive standpoint, if we can come up with ways that help our commercial industry that is heavily invested already in millimeter wave more competitive at millimeter wave, that actually gives us a foot up in the global competition and these spectrum wars.
I like the comments on the security aspects, because always, sadly, but industry is not usually driven primarily by security, at least historically. So I can see that as an opportunity. So I don't want to hog the conversation at all. So I just wanted to start the pump. So yes, please.
Hi, I'm Teresa Hitchens with Breaking Defense. Thank you for your presentation. Some of it went over my head. I have two clarifying questions, and the first is to you. You mentioned the start of experiments with 5G at bases in the Northwest. Can you tell me when those are starting, and can you tell me who you're working with, what network you're working with?
Okay, right now we're doing the DoD experiment at Hill, which is in the Northwest, and we're starting that now. I mean, we're having meetings now, so it's going to take a little while. I don't think the award has been yet made to whoever's going to actually do it, but that's supposed to be forthcoming. But we've had a lot of planning meetings associated with what we actually want to do. And again, if you talk about, modeling spectrum, that's going to be one of the big things we're going to do at Hill, is modeling spectrum and everything else associated with it. So yes, so it's going to be very interesting how that plays out. And the other one is in Nellis, which is the National Warfare Center.
That's out west.
That's Northwest. That's both Northwest and they're right next to each other. One's Nevada, one's Utah. They have to be next to each other. And that's going to be one of the things. Now, that's different. That's the experiments we're doing. That's different than putting the LTE at the bases. The LTE is bases. That one, the RFIs went out, and that award should be, or the opportunity to lease should be coming out this quarter.
For those two bases?
No, for all 15,
for all
17 bases.
17 in the Northwest.
The Northwest.
And that's the wait, did you just say RFI comes out?
The RFI has already been out.
RFI's out.
The opportunity, see, it's not an RFP. You have to understand. It's an opportunity to lease. Because it's not a pure competition, because you like this, since it does not fall into competitive personnel and associated with it, the opportunity to lease comes out of the basis for the Civil Engineering Corps to actually determine who is the best qualified, and they can do an award based upon who's best qualified without having a pure competition per se that you normally have in RFP.
So ATT and whoever can just kind of put in a thing, and then they judge from
they
the
do.
RFI.
Yes, but not from the opportunity to lease.
From the opportunity to lease. And when will that happen? I'm sorry.
It should be this quarter.
This quarter. Okay.
Yes, that's the plan. Let's say that's the plan. Things change.
And just the experiments that you talked about at the DoD level.
Right.
Can you just give some more detail about when, where, how?
Yeah,
what?
so we can clarify that.
So not confused between the experiments
exactly.
and
So the Air Force
Right.
has 10 bases in the southeast part of the United States and 17 that
Yep.
Frank's talking about in the Northwest. Separately is 4 test environments that Frank also talked about when he was talking. And those are DoD test environments,
Yep.
1 for each service. And that's purposely done so that we do share the information, and this is lessons that are learned from each other. So this is actually very, very much joint. It's actually going really well in that regard. The Air Force Base is Hill Air Force Base, and that's where the confusion is because there's overlap.
There's overlap.
So Hill Air Force Base is spectrum sharing. That's in Utah. Then McChord is in Washington State, and that is Army, and that's focused
Army Air Force.
focused on.
It's a joint base.
But it's Army's the one that selected that joint base.
You got the C-17s there, right? The Globemasters.
See, we get back and forth. Yeah.
And that's going to be focused. The first use case, anyway, is focused on augmented reality, virtual reality for training.
Yep.
And then there's 2 bases that are set for depot or warehousing, managing inventory. One of them is in Albany, Georgia. That's the Marines. Mm-hmm. And then the other one is the joint base it's the Navy base in San Diego.
Yeah.
And that,
Yeah.
So those are the four locations.
Yeah.
And that one, basically the RFP should go out this quarter as well. Mm-hmm. And so the vendors have not been selected for that yet.
Good. Glad to hear about the robust efforts in the DoD to actually play, because that's the only way you learn. You only learn the problems.
It's actually really, again, this is one of those. It's really impressive, because I haven't heard of other places around the world where the military is actually doing this, but it's very much because we believe that it's really going to have an impact on our operations and cost and all the different areas there. And I think a lot of the world is going to be watching this. I think it's pretty significant.
That's great. It's an example where the DoD can be ahead, right, and trying to deploy and kicking the tires.
Exactly right. And the other one, I think it's a really good way to work together more closely with industry. And even as the lessons that we learn get shared with other countries, we're building more relationships with other countries. So I feel like it's teaming up in multiple ways.
Excellent. So, yes, more from the audience questions. I'm happy to ask, but I want to give people a chance. So, good. Anita, please.
Anita Balachandra from TechVision 21. If I could ask you, Dr. Grayson, please, to elaborate on one of the first points you made. You said a lot of people get distracted by issues of spectrum and spectrum allocation in particular. I'm one of those people, and I'd love to be educated. If you could elaborate on that point, why should we not be worried about spectrum allocation?
So a couple things. First of all, the point I was trying to highlight there is people think spectrum equals high frequency equals high bandwidth. And I think you've heard a little bit from both the other speakers. High bandwidth is nice, but most of the killer apps are going to come from that low latency and the virtualization and the connectivity that comes with that. Those attributes don't care that much about spectrum. Spectrum is all about driving bandwidth, primarily. There are a lot of other things that have to happen that frankly become more important than spectrum, for example, to drive latency. I can have all the spectrum and bandwidth in the world, and if I've got a slow, clunky core that the data is trying to go over, I'm still going to have multiple seconds of latency, and my robot's not going to move very smoothly, okay? Or the drones are going to crash into each other, or the self-driving cars are going to crash into each other. Spectrum alone doesn't fix that, okay? I think the reason that spectrum grabs a lot of attention for a couple of reasons. One, it's a good, meaty political thing because it touches policy, and
politics too.
And it touches politics. Two, there are singular technologies you can point to that make it simpler to talk about. Things again like full network architectures that gets so complex and it's mushy. Saying I need a better amplifier or a better transmitter of some kind or a better antenna, that becomes more tangible and people can argue about those things easier. I think where spectrum becomes most important, I think there are two aspects of spectrum that we at least have to keep an eye on. And again, my counterparts here both alluded to this. We do have to worry about spectrum sharing. Okay. DARPA has also invested a lot in, and besides the Spectrum Collaboration Challenge, there have been a number of programs in the past that we've had in my office looking at either spectrum coordination, or spectrum co-use. Can you actually start developing waveforms that don't step on each other even though you're in the same spectrum? So there are technical ways to get around these spectrum conflicts. I think a lot of the spectrum challenges, frankly, are more policy, where policy hasn't caught up with some of the technology. Another great example to that is the millimeter wave spectrum that everyone focuses so much attention on. The very reason the commercial industry is struggling so much with millimeter wave, that these channels are unstable and you got to have antennas all over the place, kind of points to, do we really have to slice who owns pieces of spectrum so finely when it can't propagate far enough to interfere with each other? There are other ways maybe to share the spectrum than just actually people owning bands of spectrum, but that's where the policy is right now. Okay, so I think it's more of a policy issue than a technical issue. I don't think it's the thing that's driving the key attributes of 5G, the most important attributes. And at the end of the day, I think that I think the other thing that I worry about related to spectrum, but it's not the spectrum issues and it's not the bandwidth issues, are the economics and the business side of it. This is not a spectrum conflict. This is a standards conflict. This is a vendor and design conflict. I don't care what band someone picks. If there is a band or a set of bands that become globally dominant, and there's one company or one country that kind of owns that particular standard, that to me is more worrisome.
But isn't that exactly the worry?
I don't think so, because again, and I'm being parochial because of the things my office has been trying to push research-wise, but we're pushing this theme of come one, come all heterogeneity and federated approaches. So again, not explicitly tied to 5G, but we've been doing a lot in my office of how can I have standardless standards? How can we build networks out of various different networks? Make heterogeneous virtual networks. So what I'd like to see happen, instead of us being so fixated on, what is the right spectrum to use or what's the right band to use, how can I could I turn it around and say, let's suppose there is, I won't mention any names, but some other country or their key vendor that gets a lock in a region of the world. Instead of saying now everyone has to go buy their equipment, what if I could say I've got a North American company that is using a different band or a different standard, but guess what? I can make them interoperable. And I can still compete then, even though that someone else might have made a different choice. So we're pushing the notion of if you can be federated, it avoids that vendor lock or that standards lock. If I can be, that's where a lot of our research is right now.
Yeah, that's fascinating. I can't resist making a quick comment because I knew some people in your office who worked wireless programs. I knew Preston Marshall, for example, right, who was working sharing spectrum, right? I have to make the remark that the way we license spectrum, I'm just expanding on something Tim said, the way the government licensed spectrum today means that almost all the spectrum is never used most of the time, which is ridiculous compared to the technology we have. Yeah. It's absolutely ridiculous. But, yeah, we still do it that way, right? There's no reason to do it that way, especially not when you're at millimeter wave, right? Anyway, I couldn't resist. So let me make sure, I want to give people a chance to say, I'll get to you, but I want to make sure, any other questions from the audience? Okay, go.
I just wanted to follow up on her question because I want to make sure I understood what you just said. And that is, essentially you're saying that you're looking at ways for American companies to be able to be interoperable with other countries and vendors who you did not name, but we all know who they are, in ways that allow them to be interoperable but not use the same bandwidth or the same spectrum. Is this analogous to what we're trying to do with GPS being interoperable with BeiDou and European one, Galileo? Is it analogous to that?
There are some similarities. The thing I can talk more directly to, we've been doing something, and again, this is not 5G related, but one of the things we've been working on, have a huge success in my office, is just getting at the level, not say of frequencies and radios or waveforms, but at a message level. So we've got, across DoD, we've got a lot of different systems that use different messages and data formats. So, there are always debates over, what global standard are we going to use? Well, the approach we're taking is, come one, come all. So, people show up with 5 different standards. Can we have software that generates translators between each of those standards so they can still talk to each other even though everyone came to the table with a separate standard?
So Babblefish.
That's a great way to think of it. So we're already doing that for data level types of things and data formats and data messages. I'm just posing, that as an analogy to say, could we do similar things with RF, with waveforms? If I have, and I think this is where your GPS analogy might be a good one. If I have a software-defined radio that can access enough of the spectrum that it can speak all the different millimeter wave bands and sub-6, then it can show up in some part of the world, and maybe there's another, a particular implementation that's dominant in that part of the world. It can jump in and be the Babblefish and speak that language, and now it's the translator to all the other U.S. equipment that maybe was built for a North American environment that's using a different band. Contrary views, or is that consistent with what you guys are both?
Oh yeah, that's what we're trying to do. Yeah.
No, that's actually interesting. So if you accept the latency argument, right, then it's not the big deal. Although the FCC is hip deep in debating, right, the spectrum releases, and there's various camps weighing in on that topic, which we could go on and on and on. But I wanted to ask a question for Dwayne in the Industrial Policy Office. So we all understand the challenges of 5G and the fact that, the commercial world is really leading the technological piece of it, and the military is figuring out how to work with the commercial vendors. What's the health of our industrial base in the U.S.? Are there things that we should be doing? Are there things the government should be doing in the industrial base? Are we good, or do we have gaps? What's your view of the health of the industrial base in 5G?
So I think that, so let's go to the obvious area, and that is the basic infrastructure. So there's 5 vendors for mobile communications, and 3 of them are from free world countries without the government controlling the company. And those 3 companies are very sound. I don't think that, from my viewpoint anyway, all 5 are very capable companies. Not one stands out amongst the other. It's all standards-based. They all have worldwide experience. So having 3 vendors that are very capable is a very sufficient position. So I don't feel like we're vulnerable in that, despite what a lot of the press might say.
That's why I'm asking, right? Just to get your viewpoint, right?
Yeah, I think we're in good shape. I mean, that's what the U.S. market is going to operate on. That's been the decisions. And there's 3 vendors, and they're going to do fine. And even with spectrum, the U.S. market, even if it's not the largest market in the world, it's the most lucrative market for these companies. So they're not going to pass it, and they're going to provide all the equipment that's necessary for that spectrum. So I don't think we're in bad shape. I think actually we're in good shape, and they're moving aggressively to try to get new innovation out there. And so I think a lot of this is misinformation.
So is there a role for the government? I'm asking particularly, is there a role for the government in maybe stimulating the industrial base?
I think we need to work.
See, I'm from a policy place that works on
policy. So I think,
is there a role for the government?
Definitely, I think it's important. I'd say, so this is me speaking again. I think there's three key areas. What's innovation, countries, and companies. We need to put the pedal to the metal related to innovation and do anything we can to really foster that, especially with these advanced technologies. And so that's part funding, it's testing. Actually, I think is a great opportunity for our vendors to come in and test on our bases, because this is real-world application opportunity. And we're helping them with getting real data, real experience as well. So those kind of things. I think there's policy areas that I'm not directly involved in, but I'm sure others are, again, fostering supply chain, fostering the trades so that they can get all the different parts and components and all of that. So I think there's roles for the government in that. then the companies, I think, again, it's working together. How do we get our companies working together so that we're really helping each other out, because there's a lot of lessons learned from each other. And then the countries, we can't do it alone. And, as I said, all three of those vendors that I just mentioned are not American. But they're friendly countries. They're ones we have cooperative relationships with. They're ones that we should be supporting and fostering and building those relationships up. And then, as I said before, 5G is not just the narrow area that everybody's paying attention to in terms of the infrastructure. We're talking about handsets, and then we're talking about all those other areas that are going to come into play with 5G. As I said, drones, autonomous vehicles, robotics. And so we have to pay attention to those, and that's where we really want to make sure we're fostering our industry.
And I wanted to pile on that particular point, because so often when we think industrial base and anything related to telecommunications, there's such an industrial age model of telco that it's owner-operators and big equipment vendors. And you can really count the number of players on your hands with those things. But to the point that Dwayne was just making, I think 5G is going to be very different than what we've seen in telecommunications in the past. And, it's January, New Year, everyone likes to make predictions. I'm going to make a prediction here today that I think we're going to see a whole new market of third-party types of vendors that are in an amorphous, almost Geek Squad kind of role in between technology developers and service providers. So in something like smart manufacturing, 5G and the virtualization that comes with 5G produces an opportunity where someone can come in without having to have huge amounts of capital infrastructure. You talk low barrier to entry. So this could be a small startup that could come in to say, I'm going to now build a capability to go implement smart factories. And I'm just going to do it for one major Fortune 100 industrial company. They don't have to go build an entire regional telecommunications infrastructure to go do that. They could lease it from one of those owner-operators and then bring some of their own equipment. So I think that kind of opportunity to create a whole new market here that is not yet, doesn't even really exist, it's very nascent. That's exactly the kind of thing, without getting into political debates about industrial policy and picking winners and any of that, just by picking very clear-cut, defense-oriented applications. We can help go out and provide funding opportunities and research opportunities for these, new emergent types of third-party capability providers in this 5G space that can help stimulate that through actually building products.
That excites me, because a lot of innovators are the smaller players, and if they have a chance, it gets new ideas on the table. Otherwise, you'll never see them.
Well, that's why we're pushing the SBIR's program to death.
Yeah, I'm glad to hear that you believe there's a role.
One more comment, and that is there are a lot of very significant U.S. players that have a significant role in 5G. I know we have somebody from Cisco here, and Cisco is going to be a major player in 5G, and so we have a number of U.S. companies. So U.S. is not being left out of the 5G market.
Fantastic. So, audience questions? I could go on and on, but I try to stop myself.
So if there are no specific questions, the other U.S. companies, I'm going to throw out something else that may be a little bit provocative. And again, I'm not going to mention any companies' names, but going back to the notion of virtualization, including virtualization of the core, and my comment I just made about the barrier to entry and a lot of capital infrastructure. The big vendors, the remnants of old Ma Bell, they own right now all of that sunk specialized infrastructure, the central offices and the wireline core networks that connect those central offices. And then everything else we know of as wireless hangs off of that very capital intensive infrastructure. If again, not in the first implementation of 5G, but it's some series of increments down the road. I think we will get to a point where you start having 5G core networks that are big server farms running software-defined networks. Now think about what companies have gargantuan data warehouses with lots and lots of server farms that could host thousands of software-defined networks. Really, the only thing you need,
You don't have to go far.
you need
West.
three
A little west
things.
of here,
Yeah,
right?
you need three things to create an entire telecommunications infrastructure with what's emerging out of 5G. You need a big high bandwidth fiber backbone connecting your data centers. You need data centers with lots of servers, and then you need some edge. But again, the antennas are getting smaller. I need a lot of them. But you need to start putting out antennas for edge and for the RAN, radio access network. Okay, I'll just leave it at that and let you think about what companies are out there that technically and resource-wise and in terms of at least two of those three things they've already got a lot of. Who knows where the market goes?
So I wanted to ask Frank a question, actually, from the deployment area. So I'm glad to hear about these multiple efforts that are going on to test and kick the tires. So in your experience supervising some of these or being responsible for them, what are some of the tougher problems that you're encountering as you try to get these things up, at least at the base level? What are the issues that you're
Personnel.
running into?
It's usually personnel issues. Surprisingly enough, it's usually, I'll tell you, the biggest issue we have right now is where you put the antennas. I mean, this
What
is.
do you mean, like expanding? Is that like
They don't-
regulation-wise? Or
No,
just,
no. This is the base commander saying, "I don't like the antenna there. I want it there." And then, really, this is what you. It's personnel issues, personality issues, and the issue is, and the vendors and then saying, "Well, that's not going to work over there. let's try it over here.
Right?
Let's try it over here.
Yeah.
And so it's a give and take relationship because
Don't block my view of the golf course.
yeah, well, about
Put it right in the middle of the golf course, like at an Air Force base.
That's
It'll
right.
Make it popular. Put it right in the
That's
golf
right.
course.
That's one of the issues that we have. Now, a lot of it's not electrical so much because since you can do sharing across all the antennas, it's not so much the electrical as long as you have a base station and you have the base station outward. So it's not that so much. It's really the siting issues and where you want the coverage. And the internal, and when we talk about internal coverage in the buildings, the question is what are you going to do for the internal coverage of the buildings? Now, some of these are historical buildings. They have big, thick walls.
Yeah.
So we say, hey, we want that in that building. Okay, now we get into where can I put the antenna? And we get into those issues. And so I think the worst issues we have, we didn't expect this. We did not expect all the siting issues that we actually have. We went through the spectrum pretty quick. We went through the environmental pretty quick, relatively, considering everything. It's been the siting issues and where you want to put everything in to make sure that we get the coverage that we wanted. Because a lot of times what we find is that, somebody says, I'm going to put a tower in your base. Okay. They throw a tower up there. How much does it cover? Well, it covers whatever the tower covers. And we're like, well, that's not really good enough. We want to be covering like over there. And so when you get the leasing opportunity out, we basically tell them where we want the coverage to occur. And it's all the housing areas, too, because that's another issue. I mean, they'd like to do the housing. They don't like to do, like, the flight line way out there, and they don't like to do anything out of buildings. And so it's an issue of them being competitive and getting the return on investment. So that's why we have to put everything together into a package deal for them so they get a better return on investment. And I tell you, we bundle the bad bases with the good bases. Bad bases meaning they're far out, they're in more remote areas. They don't have the same population as some of the good bases, which are really very good areas and have a lot of population and have a lot of capabilities. They can return on investment. So we bundle the bases together so they get a average return on investment that's acceptable to their corporation.
So is it safe to say that Air Force is like an early adopter in trying some of this network deployment?
Oh yeah, we are the early adapter. Yes, we've done lots of things to speed up the adoption because we really need it badly. And we realized that multiple years ago, especially after we did the first, smart base, when we knew right away this was not going to work. We need to put stuff out there faster, and we're trying to do the flight line of the future idea, which just means I have to do everything on the flight line. I mean, there's no connectivity on the flight line to do it.
Yes, okay, good. We're priming the pump. The pump's going. So yes, on this side.
When I hear you say that about these flight lines and antennas and data centers and everything, I have a question about power with this. That is a huge cost, and it's only going to
I mean, it does for us, but not so much because the base has its own power stations and things. so we're a little bit different. So we can afford to do a lot of that already. We do power monitoring anyways to actually see how much power we're actually using at the base because we have to. I mean, it's the way that it's a cost for the base. And so when we talk about, you know, when we let a contract do the work, a lot of times we give GFE power to the vendors to actually do the work, and it's just one of those things. But because we know they need power. Now, if they go excessive past what we meter, then we'll probably come back and say, hey, you guys are eating all the power. We're going to have to do something about it. But
like sustainability.
Yes.
Too, as you continue to add coverage.
Yes.
You know, it's only
But that's.
So can I talk about, and it's just the technology related to 5G and the way it's going to be set up. 5G is going to move more of the intelligence of the network out closer to where the people, to the users. Partly because it can't handle processing so much data going back and forth. And so because of that, actually some of the power requirements are going to be dispersed. So rather than one big core network or core center, we're going to actually move the data centers out closer to the users, and so there'll be less power at a smaller area, more spread out, and it'll be more dispersed. That makes it more complicated for network design because now it's places that weren't used to having such power requirements. So that's what's going to make network design very complicated, but it's going to be trade-offs there, and power is going to be a huge factor on that.
I mean, that being said, I mean, I agree completely. I haven't seen any numbers that say it's going to be more or less power on average. It's going to be different. Instead of really power, I mean, right now we've got really power-hungry central offices, and with one big base station tower sticking up that's also power-hungry. You know, the systems the 5G systems by themselves take a lot less power, but they're going to be a lot more of them. They're going to be more dispersed. I think the other interesting thing. And I'm just speaking from personal experience. I mentioned early on that I've done a lot of red teaming of telecommunications infrastructure, and that's power from a resiliency standpoint is always one of the overlooked things in that infrastructure, and again I think that the distributed nature is going to be good news, bad news in that regard. It means I've got to get more power, more different places. But if there is, at any given point, a lower power need, that means, for example, I am more resilient to very localized power disruption. If the power goes out at a central office or a base station somewhere, I better hope that backup generator kicks right in or my whole network's down. Whereas if I get, a city block that goes out and everything's distributed, maybe I lose just one very localized region, but my whole network doesn't go down. It's things like that. Maybe if any given point is lower power from a DoD expeditionary perspective, I can rely more on generators, or maybe it's actually amenable to use of more renewables, because any given local power draw is smaller. So I think there's actually a lot of opportunity. Maybe even it becomes synergistic. Another soapbox of mine, I won't go down this rabbit hole, but I think there's all kinds of things that could be done from an energy distribution that actually that's another great killer app for 5G, sharing the information for doing more agile types of energy distribution. So I think they go hand in glove.
Since the topic is security related to the same thing, I would just bring up this architecture for 5G is going to have pros and cons related to security as well, because as we're distributing it out like that, that means a lot of the traffic is going to stay in a local area. It won't go back to the core network. That has a positive and a negative. The positive is, especially personal identification information, doesn't have to go back and forth, so that it can be kept more secure. That's the positive side. The negative side is now there's more attack surfaces. There's more vulnerabilities at that area. Right. And so that's where security is going to have to be designed very differently than we're used to now. And that's what I'm saying. There's so many different complexities related to 5G, and all of them impact security, and all of these need to be analyzed. So we're at a early point in even just identifying what all these different security issues are, let alone solving them.
Well, you can always use some of that extra bandwidth that you get for
Right.
security, right? Just to say that cavalierly. Yeah, I just wondered there was a question there, and then I'll get to Sid. So you had a question.
In terms of the test beds, you talked a lot about bringing in some of the different vendors to test out their equipment. I was wondering if you would work with any government agencies. For example, NOAA has mentioned that it might affect their ability to gather weather information.
No, I don't know.
Well, I know the guy at NOAA. I know the guy at NOAA that actually has that problem. Used to work with him, but.
Are you still friendly?
Yes, we're still friendly. Yeah, barely. But no, I haven't talked to him about that either. So it's a question. It's interesting because I do know him very well. So I'll probably have to go back in and say, hey, what's going on with your life, and maybe we can actually do something again.
So currently, a lot of the testing is just vendor-based. Then it's not government agency-based.
The experiments are all going to be probably vendor-based. Now, we may bring in, we haven't talked about bringing in NOAA, but that's interesting, though, because it might be an interesting capability that we can actually bring them in and say, hey, why don't you, we kind of talked about bringing in other agencies to actually be part of, understand the experiments that we're doing. But we wanted to get the experiment started first before we start inviting other people in.
I think
This is a great point. We have a resource in all of you, too. If you have ideas of even agencies that we should be working with on this, or use cases that you think that really are applicable that we may not be paying attention to, please share them with us, because we're still at an early stage. We'll be glad to bring that to people and try to make some of these decisions together.
I'm going to twist your question just a little bit, because the reality is I know of very few government agencies that would actually have, GS civilians out there doing experimentation. You're still probably talking about contractors doing a lot of the work. I think one of the very interesting questions in all of this, and I see a handful of folks here from, I'll call it the traditional defense industrial base, there's an interesting question in all of this is, to what extent do DIB contractors engage in this research? And there's yet another, private, quasi-public kind of partnership that I think is worth exploring, of if a traditional defense contractor is going to be doing research for some place like the Air Force or DARPA, under a traditional government, cost reimbursable kind of contract with government purpose rights, is there an opportunity for the defense contractors to partner with commercial players? And where is the dual use there? Are defense contractors interested in selling in the commercial market, which, frankly, in some ways is a more difficult marketplace than DOD, if DOD is what you're used to? I think there's a whole additional range of questions from an industrial-based standpoint that we will end up exploring in this 5G area.
Excellent. So, Sid, you had a question.
Thanks. Sid Pope, I'm in the Trust and Assured Microelectronics program, and work plans and policy. The Congress, in the National Defense Authorization Act, Section 324, is directing us to the department to develop a standard for a trusted microelectronics supply chain to address security, particularly security for 5G implementation. And quite honestly, it's a new area for me, and I'm trying to figure out where I should best start in looking at what standards already exist that are being used to support secure implementation of 5G in the infrastructure. Can you provide any advice in that area?
I don't have anything.
I mean, the problem I have, okay, we talked about supply chain. The supply chain, there's two types of supply chain. Supply chain for the edge devices. It's going to be really one of the most important things out there. Now, I'm talking about phones. We're talking about any other edge device out there, all the IoT sensors, the robots, everything else that we haven't even thought about yet. In fact, we have a SIBR with another set of sensors that were coming on that are not traditional, old or new. They are actually sensors that have energy from the vibration of the motors that they be sensors on. So they're energy free for us per se. But it's a question of, edge devices is going to be the big thing and what components are going to end up in those edge devices. That's one thing. Then the other one always wants to be able to the supply chain for the actual core of the network, which has been where it's always been. So I don't know, it's a toughie to say which way you want to go. But I know the microelectronics was always a big deal with the Senate staffers because they didn't believe that we spent enough time or money into that area. So that's a push, but.
Well, I figured they could start with microelectronics, they'll just work their way up to systems.
Yes.
So I can't speak authoritatively on this because most of the work related to this, there is a lot of work related to your question within DARPA. Most of it is in the Microsystems Technology Office tied to the Electronics Resurgence Initiative. So they're looking at that issue of microelectronic supply chain access writ large. I don't know a lot of the details of that effort, but I know there are two macro level approaches they're taking. One is, they're really both tightly related, but are there unique niche types of things that don't require a $10 billion foundry to go build that could still be a U.S. trusted industrial base? I think, just from my own experience, I think an example of that, I can't speak for ERI, are things like the analog components. I mean, that's something that the U.S. has really taken a lead, and frankly, DoD has taken a lead at a lot of the development of those kinds of components. So I think things like some of the analog components or something there that we could still think of trusted sourcing. There's an awful lot in the mixed signal and the digital that's like, hey, it's Wild West, and we're not competitive in terms of a U.S. trusted industrial base perspective. And I know the other half of ERI is looking at how can I use parts sourced from third parties in other countries that aren't trusted sources and still use them in a trusted manner. How can I add trust after the fact or augment them or test them or a variety of different things? And again, the ERI guys could talk more authoritatively to that.
I just have to add a really quick comment that I believe, and I was listening to the virtualization comments that you made before, I think that the bandwidth and the virtualization that 5G enables, that gives you, could be used for some interesting security concepts that I don't think are being led by industry. So there's a potential government opportunity there. I think there's definitely things that can be done with the slices that you have available to you. I mean, it can be good or bad, right? It can also be used for security. I think there's opportunities that are pretty exciting. So, yes, from the back.
Given the uncertainties of 5G implementation, talked about security, I guess I was curious from a DoD implementation perspective, how mature is the value proposition? I mean, are the pilots intended to inform the budgetary discussions that go into them? I mean, for example, look at ERP. There was a big discussion many years ago about widespread implementation. It costs a lot of money to figure out how to do it correctly. Maybe ERP. So I guess I'm curious how mature the value proposition discussions for 5G.
I'll start. We go back to the value proposition is mission. See, this is where it gets interesting because it's pure mission related. For instance, if we could fix the maintenance issues, we will save lots of mission time. And so that's what you're getting into. The value proposition is in personnel time as well as being able to send missions out faster. And that's where the value is. Now, it's difficult to quantify per se until you get some real figures there that says, let's run the experiment and say, hey, all of a sudden now I can maintain an aircraft fast 10%, 20% faster. And that pushes the mission faster. That's the whole purpose of this. Same with the depot.
So the hope is the depots will inform those kinds of discussions?
Yes, because even when we do the experiments, we're going to have some metrics coming out of the experiments. Because otherwise, why bother doing an experiment?
I hate to say it, but you have 35 hours. That was supposed to help with those kinds of things, but a lot of that turned down.
Yeah.
From a technology maturity perspective, I think the answer is it depends, and it's going to be more of a mission and application question than a technology maturity. If someone wants to go do something today at this very moment with some early implementation of 5G, there is nothing that stops you from at the endpoint setting up a VPN, the same way I would with any communication system now. or slapping a DoD crypto box on it or something like that. It's just a pipe at that point in time. So there's nothing intrinsically that prohibits us using more traditional kind of security on top of 5G. It just doesn't allow us to take advantage of all the features of 5G. Where I think a lot of the the security immaturity comes in is when we get into things like slicing. And if we really want to push virtualization and push new types of, how can I create something the equivalent of a secure channel where I don't have crypto boxes hanging on either end? Mm-hmm. That in that case, I think the technology is still pretty immature, but I think there's a lot of opportunity space to explore.
Mm-hmm. So I see we're coming up on 4. I wanted to try to wrap this up by 4 o'clock. So one of the strategic questions I love to talk about the science nerd stuff, but at policy we talk about more strategic level questions. There's a lot of in the press, a lot of gloom and doom, right, about foreign domination of 5G technology, foreign domination of perhaps standard setting for 5G. Is it too late for us? It's not what I'm hearing, but is it too late for us? Has the ship sailed, or are we still serious players, and does the future look reasonable for the U.S. efforts in 5G? Let me put that question out to the panelists, because there has been a lot of gloom and doom in the press, right? At least that I've read.
Let's do it first.
Okay, I'll say I don't see it as gloom and doom, but I do see there are areas that we can pay attention to in each area. Spectrum, we were saying, I'm not an expert at spectrum, but basically you need the full spectrum is the greatest advantage. And there's areas that we can pay more attention to and try to get better optimization on the spectrum area. In terms of deployments and all, we see all the U.S. operators going full force. There's nothing slowing them down at this point in terms of actually trying to roll this stuff out. And in terms of security, I think that's one where we have a lot of attention, and it still will need a lot of attention because it's a developing technology, and so there's a lot of areas that. So basically, my answer is all of the areas need a lot of attention, but that doesn't mean it's a dire situation. If we ignore these areas, then it's a dire situation.
Okay. Good. Fair enough. Anyone else like to weigh in on that?
I mean, the DoD is starting to participate in the standards bodies now. And so I think it's it's not so much a catch up. It's let's try to actually do something and get in there and really move around now, because I think that's where we all have to go for the next releases and whatever else. And so it's mainly probably a correction of what's currently there as opposed to anything else. But again, this is going to evolve. It's an evolution issue, and it's not going to stop with this release 15. We have release 16. That's in the process. They're going to be release 17. So it's not going to be it's a complete slam dunk. We can't change anything from that point on because it is an evolution. And as we know that the vendors that are out there the standards are the standards, but the way they implement them can be very different.
Fair enough. So Tim, you want to add something?
Yeah, so I kind of echo the other two gentlemen's thoughts. I'm cautiously optimistic. I think that there is reason for the worries. It is very possible for a company or a country, when they show signs of exerting control and influence over standards, which has been seen, to try to create standards or vendor lock. You could imagine if I don't pick any company or any particular implementation standard. If it goes into a region and it gets a dominant market share and attempts to implement it in such a way that is very unique to their offering, that's a risk. I don't care if you're a country, a government, a military, or a business. Anytime someone gets a lock on a market, that's a risk that we have to watch out for. Where I am, in addition to what the other two gentlemen said about, the game isn't over yet. We're barely in Act 1 right now, to mix metaphors. The other advantage that I think we have, and again, this is a good news, bad news story. I'm going to repeat what I said before. The barrier to entry in 5G is relatively low compared to prior standards. So even if someone comes in and starts dominating a standard or dominating a particular implementation, my prediction is that's very short-lived. If you look at what, if you go back, 20 years to the dot-com era, 20 years still.
I'm getting old.
Everyone talked about software eating the world, and barrier to entry to putting up a website is so low that it replaces someone having a really cool technology with being fast. People started talking about time to market. I think 5G is going to start creating that same kind of thing in the telecommunications world, which has historically been much more capital intensive and technology intensive. So watch the speed metric as much as who dominates a technology. And I want to, since we're about done, I think the other competitive thing, this gets back to my ask that I said I was going to come to. I think our single biggest competitiveness challenge is on the personnel front. This is a very unique and high-demand talent base. I started off by saying we don't really have a lot of concrete, tangible efforts going on in DARPA. And to be blunt about it, we haven't been able to recruit the program management talent that we want to lead these kind of things. I'm hearing the same kind of stuff from industry. That's one of the reasons we have such a hard time competing. I had one program manager that we had made an offer to and had on the hook. He called me up sheepishly and said, I am so sorry, but commercial company XYZ offered me $1 million signing bonus. We can't compete with that. Companies are competing with each other. So, and it's global. It's a global talent base. So it's the people and it's the talent that worries me the most in this competitiveness.
So one final question opportunity. Good. I think everyone had a chance to ask. So on behalf of the Venable and the Potomac Institute, I want to thank. Let's give our panelists a hand. Thank you very much. And stay tuned. I think we'll probably do a third in our 5G series focused on another thematic area. So stay tuned. We'll have that up. So thank you everyone for attending and have a nice day.